All right, welcome back, Minnesota historians. Recently, we were discussing a little bit about the farmers and how people in rural places in Minnesota um, in the late 1800s, early 1900s started to try to get what they wanted, try to make their lives better. We saw, the big industry of the late 1800s and early 1900s created a lot of very wealthy people. The farmers were not part of that. They really were struggling during that era, and we got to see how they tried to do it politically by helping create third parties, and those third parties could influence the Democrats and Republicans to try to get some things done for them. And so we're now going to look at maybe a little bit more of how industry changed. We'll talk about the progressive era of the late 1800s, early 1900s in Minnesota. When you look at the word progressivism, uh, progressivism is a movement to solve various social and political problems through government action. So, who do people want to solve these problems for them? That is the government. We saw that a little bit with the farmers, right? Those progressive ideas that they had. They were sick and tired of monopolies, and they wanted the government to outlaw monopolies. Somebody that would say, no, we want less government, they might say, you know what? No, monopoly, hey, they just have the best business principle. Who gets hurt with monopolies, though? The consumers, the regular people. And so we look at the government action to solve these issues is progressivism. And some of these progressive ideas work and some of them don't. Progressive ideas can be on different sides of the spectrum. A progressive idea could simply be, um, everybody should be wearing a seatbelt. The government created a law that people should wear a seatbelt. Some people are saying, no, we don't want that. Other people are saying, yes, we do. People need to be wearing seatbelts so when there's car accidents, people aren't dying. And that would be a progressive idea that's become a law. It doesn't start overnight. Doesn't take place overnight. It it's a long progress. You look at other progressive ideas in the country today. Legalizing marijuana would be a progressive idea. It could be another progressive idea on the opposite end of the spectrum could be outlawing tobacco. That might be a progressive idea. Some people want tobacco outlawed. Some people think marijuana should be legalized. Two progressive ideas on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there really wasn't a lot of government influence in a lot of these decisions. The government was basically kind of laissez faire, step back, say, we don't really care. If you're having problems, pick yourself up by the bootstraps and figure it out for yourself. And people were looking for the government to solve some of these issues. And we saw that with the farmers, with the creation of third parties. We're also going to see um, the creation of reformers, a person who supports changes that are intended to improve society. Sometimes a progressive change doesn't always improve society, even though people thought it would. And sometimes it certainly does. If you remember back to Growth of America, we talked about a lot of these reformers in the country, guys like Jacob Riis, who published the book How the Other Half Lives. We talked about Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book The Jungle that made our meat safer to eat across the country, right? Where they used to dump rats and whatever else into the hoppers and grind it all up into sausages. And now you have the Meat Inspection Act and the FDIC that looks over everything. So we had these reformers that helped make changes. Sometimes reformers are not very well liked, especially by big business. And these progressive ideas are not always liked by big business because big business wants to make money, and anytime you have to make changes, that costs big business money. One of the big businesses in Minnesota, besides Pillsbury and Washburn's flour mills, besides the lumber industry, was the Great Northern Railroad, and that was James J. Hill, stretched from the Twin Cities all the way out to Washington State. And a lot of these towns that popped up, whether it was out in Washington or Idaho or Montana or Wyoming, North Dakota, all these places, western Minnesota, their only link to the civilized world back east was the railroad. Otherwise, they're just out on the prairie. But if you've got the railroad, you can get your supplies back. You can also get your supplies that you need to you, right? Sears, we talked about the Sears company and how they transported stuff on the trains. And so this is your lifeline. This is your link to civilization. Um, and and the farmers out here really didn't like it, because this was their only option. The trains that came on this railroad were their only options, and it was a monopoly. They had to pay what they were asking. The first time we see maybe a problem with the railroad and their workers was the 1890s. And it used to just be, hey, you're going to work, and if you don't like it, go find a different job. Well, in the 1890s, the James J. Hill and the Great Northern Railroad cut wages, and the workers did not like that, so they went on strike. We watched the James J. Hill video that talked a little bit about this strike, and James J. Hill, of course, wasn't very happy. His transcontinental railroad was the only one that never went bankrupt, the only transcontinental railroad to never go bankrupt. So he's a very shrewd businessman. And this is the first time he faces off with a guy by the name of Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs, you would consider to be like the George Washington of unions, because he helped start a lot of unions. He ran for president, I think, like 5 times, once from jail, where he was in jail in the 1900s. But he was a guy that organized unions, and he could speak for the workers. And he organized the American Railway Union, and the American Railway Union, the ARU, went on strike in 1894, and it shut a lot of things down. And the Great Northern Railroad was completely shut down for 18 days. Workers were joining the American Railroad Union at about 2,000 workers a day were joining up. And so the railroads across the country were shutting down. The Great Northern Railroad was shutting down. And when the railroad shuts down, James J. Hill loses money. Eventually, it opens back up, and the workers get a pay raise as a result, and it goes back to what they were making before. So they didn't necessarily make more money, they just weren't losing the money. And so this was a progressive idea, an idea that workers could form a union and go on strike. And you learned about this in Growth of America, that what were the main reasons back then that people were going on strike or trying to form unions? Well, one, their wages were low. Even though they might be working 40 hours a week, they were not being paid a livable wage. So they're working hard all year long, 6 days a week, usually 60 hours a week or more, and they were still living in poverty. The second reason usually was dangerous working conditions. And the third reason was they just wanted more time off. James J. Hill and some other investors, including J.P. Morgan, Edward Harriman, they formed the Northern Securities Company, which merged a huge amount of railroads and gave these guys in the Northern Securities Company a huge monopoly. And people in Minnesota and other areas started saying, this monopoly isn't right. And they started to complain to the governor of Minnesota. It went to the Supreme Court. And in the end, it ends up being broken up. So this was the governor of Minnesota at the time in the early 1900s, 1901, Samuel Van Sant, who condemned it. And President Theodore Roosevelt, that you see here in the political cartoon, he was known as a trust buster, and a trust was a monopoly. And he broke up a few monopolies, not most of them, not all of them, just a few, but it still gained him the name trust buster. And you can see in the political cartoon, it looks like a wrestling match here. Who's looking on? That's right, Uncle Sam, representing the United States. And who is President Theodore Roosevelt wrestling? It looks like a train. And that's how as he broke up that company, they had to break it up into a bunch of small companies that would compete against each other. Now, when that happened, all the assets that James J. Hill had became actual money that went into his bank account. So he was worth millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. Today, he would be a billionaire most likely, and it all goes into his bank account, where before it was all tied up in assets. So he really doesn't lose money. He just doesn't have this huge company that he wanted to run. This is from the Minneapolis Journal that you see here. The railroad rate regulation. It looks like Teddy Roosevelt is teaching the class. The 3 R's, railroad rate and regulation. The kids are learning about it, except for this kid. He's got the dunce hat on. President Roosevelt will impress them upon the pupils of the Congress School. So this is supposed to be Congress here. And so late 1800s, early 1900s, we see unions forming and fighting back, working for rights. One of the big labor unions, one of the first labor unions to really pop up, and it doesn't start in Minnesota, but it has a lot of members in Minnesota communities, was the Knights of Labor. And they shaped a lot of business and political policy in Minnesota in the 1800s and 1880s and 1890s. The things they wanted: shorter workday, equal pay for women, child labor laws, cooperation between workers. Businesses, though, were kind of getting sick of the unions forming and wanting more rights. And in 1903, they formed the Citizens Alliance. And these were businesses and banks working together to fight back against labor unions. And they created laws against unions. So it made it illegal at times to join a union and form a union in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Local bankers forced companies to join the Citizens Alliance, or they wouldn't give them credit for their store. And we'll see a video link on the Citizens Alliance later. I actually bought this book intending to read it. It's kind of boring, so I don't know if I'm going to make it through. So some famous strikes. The Western Federation of Miners was created out in like Montana and Wyoming in 1893, but they arrive up on the Iron Range in 1905. And in 1907, they lead a strike. And we're going to read a little bit about that strike. But the mines close down. The miners say, we're not going to go down there and work anymore. So this is on the Mesabi. And what did they want? A minimum wage. And they wanted an 8-hour workday. Roughly around 16,000 workers went on strike. Now remember, the Iron Range was a melting pot of people from all over Europe, from Finland, Sweden, Norway, Germany, Italy, Croatia, Slovenia, you name it. There was like over 30 different ethnic groups living up on the Mesabi Iron Range. The Finns made up the largest group, immigrants from Finland. And over 16,000 workers went on strike and closed down several mines up there. Well, what did the mine owners do? They brought in strike breakers. They brought in people that didn't belong to the union. They shipped them up on the trains to start working in the mines. Anybody that crosses the picket line is called a scab. And so after a few months, the strike ends. Some people go back to work. Others are fired for going on strike and never go back to work. So the Finns took a pretty big hit. Now, interesting enough, if you go up to the Iron Range, they have a lot of Finnish jokes. The Finns are the kind of the brunt of a lot of the jokes and stuff up there. Some appropriate jokes, some inappropriate jokes. They don't tell Oli and Lena jokes up there. They tell, I can't remember what the name of the two guys are called, but they have Finnish names, and the jokes are like, how many fins does it take to screw in a light bulb? Things like that. Another big group union that was starting to kind of cross the country was the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. And now they had some very progressive ideas, some revolutionary ideas that scared people. They were looking, to replace and overthrow capitalism and try to create a communist society, a communist economy where you didn't pay for stuff, and things like that, and there were more rights for workers. And a lot of people were scared of this and didn't like it. This is, I believe, from the Duluth newspaper, and you can see the IWW. It stands for the Industrial Workers of the World, but the sign here says "I won't work." What's this IWW guy got? Well, he's got a gun. He's got a bomb that says riots. He's got looks like a torch that says arson. Who's kicking him out of northern Minnesota? Law and order, organized labor. They don't like the IWW. Well, in 1916, the IWW forms, and many miners join it, and over 8,000 miners walk off the job in the Mesabi Iron Range. So this is about 9 years later. There's a second major strike. The mines close down. The difference between this strike and the earlier one was this one got violent. When they tried to bring in the scabs to work, the miners said, "You're not going down in those mines," and they fought them and drove them off. There was some scuffles. At one point, 3 miners were shot and killed, and or 3 people were, I should say. One of them was the sheriff of the Iron Range town, Biwabik. And so this one turned violent. The mine owners brought in basically mercenaries from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. These were essentially just guys with guns that were going to say, all right, you have to let the scabs go down into the mines and work. You can't keep these mines closed. Now think about it. 1916, what's going on in the world? World War I is going on. The movie just came out in 1917. Reminder, the United States did not join World War I right away. It started in 1914. We don't join until 1917. You can see some of the demands, similar to before. One of the things that they wanted was higher pay for more dangerous working conditions. Everybody was getting paid the same, and the cushy jobs were going to people that maybe were born in the United States. They were going to maybe Norwegians and Swedes, Germans, people that were more like the owners of the mines, and the Eastern Europeans, the Catholics, the Southern Europeans, the Finns. They were getting the bad jobs, and they were getting bad pay, or getting equal pay to the cushy jobs. And so they wanted better pay for the tougher jobs. When they went on strike, the IWW, who got money from workers all over the country that were in the union, opened a store to provide food for the miners on credit. And yet, this is from the Virginia newspaper. When will the IWW pay strikers? They're talking about, is Germany maybe behind the strike? Is Germany over in Europe, are they behind this strike over there? Striking miners anxious and worried because IWW fails to carry out its promises. The St. Paul paper thinks Germany or its agents are making an effort to tie up the iron and copper mines. Many strikers leaving range. 30 left on one road last night. Mobs try to release the men in Eveleth. I mean, this was kind of a dangerous time up there on the range. A striking miner killed by guards, those Pinkerton guards near a mine. Over 3,000 people attended his funeral. The Biwabik sheriff was killed in a fight. Leaders of the strike were arrested. After 4 months, the strike ends, and the miners do not get what they want. So a second strike ends poorly for the miners. The Virginia Rainy Lake Timber Strike. The Virginia Rainy Lake Timber Company was one of the largest timber companies in the state. And remember, 1916, 1917, they're still going full bore. They are taking down a lot of trees in the state, shipping it down to the Great Plains all over the country. Lumberjacks were working 84 hours a week, and making the same amount as other timber jobs, working 55 hours a week. So a lot of people are not happy with their pay, and there's a big strike. And all of a sudden, the trees stop falling down in the forests. After 2 months, the strike ends, their demands are met, and they even got an extra $5 per month that they asked for. So that strike was successful. Another progressive idea at the time was women's suffrage. So yes, you have one progressive idea. Let's form unions and fight for better rights. Try to get, laws created, minimum wage law. Well, another progressive idea, let's let women vote. Until 1919, women, or 1920, women were not allowed to vote in the United States. Across the board, they were not allowed to vote. There were some states way out west that allowed it, but for the most part, women didn't have that right. So next year, this coming November, the next presidential election, girls that are 18, you will have a chance to vote on the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, which is a big deal. Women across the country started forming groups to fight for this. If you remember Harriet Bishop, the first teacher in Minnesota, she was one of the first women to form the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. It was led by 14 women in 1875, and it's a long process. The types of things that they did. They organized marches, they wrote petitions and letters, gathered signatures, gave speeches, and slowly but surely started to get more and more people on board that they should have the right to vote. One of the things that helps in Minnesota is we have a large Scandinavian population. There were many immigrants, first and second generation. They came to Minnesota, and back in Norway, women did have more rights. And so this is going to help the process in our state. And it wasn't just the right to vote that the women wanted, but they worked on other things as well, improving working conditions for the workers in the factories, urban sanitation, cleaning up the streets, trying to help people out of poverty were other things that they worked on. Clara H. Euland was the president of the Minnesota Suffrage Association in the Twin Cities. She had many suffrage parties at her house. And she was known for the quote, "Minnesota denies the vote to criminals, lunatics, idiots, and women. Is this chivalry?" Another leader in our state was Dr. Martha Ripley. She had moved from Boston, and she started a maternity hospital where women could give birth. Now, at this time in the state, in the country, many hospitals would not take in women that were unmarried. And Martha Ripley's hospital did do this. So if you were pregnant and you were not married, you could still receive treatment at her hospital. Now, at this time, they did not lose a baby for 11 years. 11 years worth of successful births. Now you think about late 1800s, child mortality rate was high. Infant mortality rate was high. And for 11 years, they didn't lose it. She was kind of like the males, that she was ahead of the curve on things like using sanitation, making sure that they were washing things off with hot water, washing their hands with soap and water. And that was not really well known throughout the country or the world at the time, that could stop the spread of disease, stop the spread of bacteria and viruses. And so they were doing things like that, and their survival rate was very high. You can see the building today is apartments. And she was also a member of women's suffrage. She insisted that there be women on the Minneapolis police force. She pushed for public health reforms. Here's a 1914 parade. Over 2,000 women were marching in it. By 1919, we had over 30,000 women in suffrage groups across the state. Sarah Colvin led a different party, the National Women's Party in Minnesota, and they were pretty radical. They did not mind getting arrested for public demonstrations. And we'll watch this video later, but 1920, the passage of the 19th Amendment, women gained the right to vote. And lastly, talking a little politics, John Johnson, governor from 1904 to 1909, was Minnesota's first progressive governor. He was the first governor that was actually born in our state. He wasn't born in a different state. He wasn't born in a different country. He was born here. Back in these days, your term was 2 years. He was elected 3 times, very popular with both Democrats and Republicans. A lot of people started thinking he might become a president at some point. Generally, if you can be popular on both sides, you have a chance to be president. So, 16th governor of our state. Some progressive bills that he passed. He reduced railroad passenger and freight rates so that the railroad could not charge as much as they wanted to. Some people would say, well, hey, that's communism, that's socialism, forcing them to lower the rates. But farmers, of course, like that. He removed constitutional restraints on the legislature's power to tax. So our state legislators could tax more and bring in more money. Of course, taxes, taxing income, things like that. People are against that many times. That was a progressive idea, but it helps pay for a lot of things in our state. Unfortunately, while in office, he goes in for an oral surgery at the Mayo Clinic, I think to remove a tumor or something, and he passes away while he was governor in 1909. So he dies young at age 48. Here's a statue of him in St. Peter by their city hall. This is outside the Capitol building. And also in St. Paul, there was a high school called St. Paul Cleveland High School. And in 1911, they renamed it St. Paul Johnson High School after John Johnson. Here is a couple years ago, they won a state game, first round, and their St. Paul Johnson kids are doing snow angels out there. Minnesota, or New Prague, we knocked off number 1 seed St. Paul Johnson back in 2011. Mr. Dipburner, Mrs. Dipburner's son. All right, and so we'll have some video links that we'll watch to go along with it, but that's kind of how Minnesotans started to respond to industry in the state.